Welcome. Just wanted to cover or do a video on the variations between the stock 21 part number, which I think is 11 in the US, and the 22 part number, which is 12 in the US. The 21 is the mid 2023 version, and the 22 came out halfway through 2023. And it's the 22 part number is the one that people are referring to as the recall part number. So I set out to actually get it put on the bike. I wanted to see what it did by stock. In my own ignorance, I didn't realize, and it's not advertised, but Woolwich, one of the things that came up was when I contacted Woolwich about doing it, they said it doesn't really matter because the 22 version that they have, actually I'll bring it up in the background while it's going. The 22 version they have is actually the entire code and data maps ripped. When they do an ECU write, they're not just writing in the map data, they're actually writing in the binary file for the code that they have. So if you were to, and I'll demonstrate it shortly, go and do the 22 version part number and write it to a 21 bike, it will actually do the ECU update, the recall version update to your bike. Now that's something I'd actually done to mine. Mine came with the 21 part number, and midway through, while I was going through this tuning process, the 22 version came out. I actually went and did the update. So if we have a look here, so these are the US ones. So this is 11 and 12, and these are the AU ones. So my bike came at the start of 2023 with the 21 version, and this 22 version is the one that came out halfway through the year. So if I write this to my bike, I've done the recall update. But a big part of it was people are saying, well, there's quite a dramatic difference in that when it's written to the bike. And I'm probably one of the few people who can actually quantify that because I can decode the log files. And one of the big ones was engine braking. Now, if I come and I've demonstrated this in a previous video. So I wrote back the stock 21 ECU. So I set the bike back completely to stock as I got it from the factory, because on the books my VIN had the 21 version. So I was taking it in to get it recalled, to get that applied, and Yamaha actually did that as a recall, or it got put through as that. So it didn't cost me anything, and it came down to the dealer being really good and nice to me. But what we have here is the engine braking graph. So this is a graph of time versus the RPM, and the interesting bit is always around the 3000 RPM. And what would happen, you can see here, the engine braking is quite linear until 3000 RPM, in which case, and if you do this on your bike, you'll feel it, the bike just wants to shoot off and accelerate. So and it's really disconcerting if, say, you were full lean over in a corner, and you just happen to hit, letting the engine braking pull you up a bit, and you happen to hit the 3000 RPM, the bike's going to take off. Turning the diesel fuel cut off just completely eliminates it, and it turns it into a line not unlike what I'll draw here, which is something very more like a lot more linear, sort of on that angle. But I won't actually leave that in. But this is the stock 21. And this is actually from a ride that I did after setting it back the weekend before I got it rewritten, which was, I think, the 30th of January. So this is the weekend before that, and this is just some data that I collected. But it's very consistent. Now, after getting the ECU updated, I went out for a ride, obviously, a weekend later, and I've grabbed from the logs 2 sets of data for the engine braking. But you can see that there's a significant difference between this one And these ones are a nice smooth curve. Both of them are. And one of the things you get, and you can see the 3000 part here, but one of the things you get is from 3000, when I noticed it just riding home after getting it done, and it wasn't plugged in logging, but it would hit 3000 RPM and start going pop, 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 just for a little bit, and then it would go back to normal. But it just didn't feel like the transition was there. And you can see from these graphs that there isn't a dramatic transition point. So if I come back to here, we've got this dramatic transition point here, and this transition point, well, this section here where it pops up and pops down, and that is actually highlighted here. And you can see that as far as the injected duration, so the amount of fuel going in, that's consistent. Oops, that's consistent, and you can see that the ignition advance is consistent through that section. So that is this section here. So this section here. All right. Oops. Doesn't matter. It's just an example. So here, this one here, we have the 3000 RPM change here, and you can see this sort of here, and here it is here. And as soon as we hit around 3000, or just below it, it drops below 3000 for the first time, and you'll notice this here, the ignition advance drops from 27 degrees before top dead center to 8 degrees before top dead center. And this is something that Woolwich actually talk about. If you want to create the popping on decel, what you do is you don't cut your fuel. Notice the fuel hasn't changed. The electronic throttle valve value hasn't changed. The throttle position is at 0, so the throttle's closed. The ECU has the electronic throttle valve open because it's not full vacuum. You still need some airflow. All right. The manifold pressure, you can see, is relatively consistent. It does go a lot higher, gets up to 80 if this was completely closed. But yeah, you can see they cut the ignition advance. And what that does is it means that the fuel that is going in, this 0.5 here, doesn't get to burn fully, and that ends up in the exhaust, and you get a bit of a pop. So after 3000, which is just hit here, you can see that it does gradually ramp back up to that. Well, here it's 26, but you can see it started at 27, 28. So it's doing this whole period here. What they're doing to make this transition smoother is they're modifying the ignition, and so that gets rid of this and just allows it to transition from one to the other. So yeah, it does feel smooth. There are other things they're doing, because you can note, this is log data, so this is actually what the bike's doing. If I come back to this one here, you can see there's no position in the electronic throttle valve. There's no major transition. Like there's this dip here to 21 degrees, but 21 from 26 is not dramatic. And after, there's nothing to indicate why this gradient's different to before. So that's something that ECU is doing on the inside. But in terms of what the ECU is doing here that we can observe is, yeah, it's cutting the ignition, or it's putting less advance in the ignition. And that holds true on this one. If we go down and 3000 RPM, boom, we can see the same. So they've gone and cut the ignition advance. They've reduced it from 27 degrees before top dead center to 7 degrees before top dead center. So we don't get full combustion. You can see here the electronic throttle valve is relatively consistent. I think this is a rounding error. Yeah, so these aren't major variations. Yeah, so this is the raw value we get. So it is 35 or 36. So it is a rounding error. You could basically mean this out. But yeah, they cut the ignition, and that is how they're getting the smoother transition from the heavier engine braking into the lighter engine braking below 3000 RPM. so hopefully people find that that interesting. And yeah, now that I've sort of done that, got these logs, and got an actual view of what's going on that people can see, I'll be writing back my 22 based version of the Flash, and continuing to ride normal. But as far as Yamaha is concerned now, my VIN is associated with the 22 version, and yeah, now my tune is going to align better with that. Not that there were no issues in getting the ECU update written on a previously flashed ECU. I did set it all the way back to stock before I took it in, and they didn't notice anything, even though I told them. So yeah, presumably the software, the Yamaha software, had no issues with it, or something would have been said, and yeah, it was no drama. But it is smoother to ride. The transition from engine braking to open throttle is not as harsh, but at the same time, I wouldn't say it's perfect. I mean, the only way you can truly get smooth throttle and get rid of some of the twitchiness, although actually I would say it is a little bit less twitchy, but I haven't ridden it long enough as it is. But I will say, even though my tunes were based on the 22 version, which I did ride for a very long time, there were still periods where it was just a bit twitchy, and you'd go along a bumpy road and it'd want to sort of jerk back and forth and whatnot. That's that. I'll close this off, and yeah, hopefully it's useful information for people. Definitely, if you don't like that transition in the engine braking, go and knock on your Yamaha dealer's door and get them to apply the ECU update. Ideally, the flash fuel cut, D-cell fuel cut is the one you want turned off, because it just makes it absolutely linear. But this is the next best option, and it works. It does make that engine braking a lot smoother, which will transform the feel of your bike quite a bit. So yeah, hopefully that's useful to people.